Vamos a empezar esta entrevista con Martin Barron. Primero quiero introducir a mi colega de muchos años, Doug Wilks, quien va a manejar la entrevista, y después Roberto Rock va a introducir Martin Barron. Doug Wilks es el editor en jefe del periódico Deseret News de Salt Lake City. Con anterioridad y por 5 años se desempeñó como director de la división de noticias de Deseret News, radio y televisión de KSL. Cuenta con más de 30 años en la industria de noticias, incluyendo muchos años en el grupo de New York Times. Roberto. Entonces, bienvenidos, Doug Wilks.
Sí, es un honor para mí muy sincero porque tengo una admiración personal de hace muchos años por el Washington Post. Yo viví en Washington en alguna época y aprendí a confirmar mi admiración por este diario que ahora dirige como editor en jefe Martin Barron, que es un periodista que tiene esta función, esta responsabilidad desde diciembre del 2012, con anterioridad nada menos, tuvo el mismo encargo, la misma encomienda en el Boston Globe por 11 años. Logró una mayor fama pública por una película donde fue representada en la película Spotlight, que seguramente le dio muchas satisfacciones y una que otra pesadilla en la calle donde la gente pidiendo su autógrafo, algo así. Pero realmente es una fama muy merecida por el trabajo periodístico de los equipos que ha comandado y por su participación también en la liberación del corresponsal del Post en Irán, Jason Rezaian. Martin Barron comenzó su labor periodística en The Miami Herald, luego en Los Angeles Times y New York Times, regresando al Herald como editor ejecutivo. A mí me encanta que uno de los nuevos motos, uno de los nuevos lemas del Washington Post es que la democracia muere en la oscuridad. Y el periodismo es una de las herramientas más poderosas para arrojar luz sobre esta circunstancia. Bienvenidos ambos en este panel que hemos venido diciendo que es un panel de lujo dentro de la Asamblea. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. With you, as many who have traveled from so far away, and certainly grateful to be here speaking with Marty today. Our format will be a conversation. Marty and I will have a conversation, ostensibly asking him questions about kind of where we are in terms of press freedoms, certainly some of the events over the past year since the election of Donald Trump in America, how that's influenced both here in America and the Americas. And we'll have our conversation in English. We'll leave plenty of time for questions. Marty speaks Spanish. I speak English and Swedish. So if you have a Swedish question, feel free to feel forward with that. But I feel a little bit like we're out to dinner, but we're sitting on the same side of the booth. But we will see how it goes, and we'll certainly speak to our audience here. Marty, to begin, the Washington Post, which has done such tremendous work, particularly during the past year, came up with the slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." So 2 questions. One, how did you land on that, and how does it inform kind of the culture of the Washington Post?
Well, it was a process that took over a year, actually. Some people think that we came up with it just for the Trump administration, but that's not the case. We started well before that. During the campaign, Jeff Bezos, our owner, said he wanted to have a motto that captured our mission, that was a short statement that would be the essence of who we are and the particular mission that we serve by being in the nation's capital. And so we had a lot of ideas. There were a lot of bad ideas. There were some good ideas, most of them not good enough. We debated endlessly, numerous meetings, and then eventually we just decided that we were going to go with Democracy Dies in Darkness. We tried using something. I have to admit that I had some concerns about having a motto that had both dies and darkness in it. But we tried something with light, and it just didn't sound right. It sounded a little cultish, and it sounded like we were patting ourselves on the back a bit.
Mm-hmm. The Deseret News has a motto to be a source of truth and light. So that's interesting.
Well, it's good we didn't take it away from you there. So that was.
Oh, we appreciate that.
Sort of the same spirit, anyway.
Thank you. Given, was that Democracy Dies in Darkness, was that reflective of the mission of the Washington Post, or was it trying to announce a new mission?
No, it was reflective of a mission that we've had for a very long time. I mean, I think that the reputation of the Washington Post was formed at the time of Watergate in the 1970s. That was an investigation that held our government accountable. We had a president who was, in fact, committing crimes. And the Washington Post was in the lead position of that investigation and was working very hard to shed light in, as we say, dark corners. And so that investigation has really shaped the identity of the Washington Post. And that is something that we wanted to incorporate in our mission statement. And I think that it does it quite well. A lot of people cheered the motto when we introduced it. And we have it on everything that we produce. And then, of course, there were some people who were concerned that it was related to Trump, which it was not. And when they raised that question with me, I always ask, well, what exactly about that phrase makes you think that it's about Donald Trump? And they can't really answer that question. So
interesting. Has the role of reporters changed in 2017, or is it simply the environment that's changed?
Well, I think it's changed. I think the mission stays the same. I think the values stay the same. I think the purpose of our work stays the same. But the way that we go about our work and the way that we present our work is changing, because right now we live in I think we have to acknowledge it, we live in a digital society. There isn't anybody in this room, I'm sure, who doesn't have a mobile phone. There's probably nobody in this room who doesn't use social media, almost nobody who doesn't use social media. So right now we're living in an environment which is digital, which is social, and which is immediate. People expect to get their news instantly. They don't expect to wait for it, to see it the following morning. They expect to receive an alert when something occurs. So that has a profound effect on how we go about our work and the kind of work we do and the way that we present our work. Because the way that people read on a phone, the way that they are reading in social media is substantially different from how they read a newspaper in the morning, perhaps over a cup of coffee. And so we have to think about that. And the relationship between the reader and the journalism is different. And so I think that calls for a style of writing, for the most part, not in all occasions, but that is more conversational with our readers, less formal, and where we now have the opportunity to show things in a way that we never did before. Not just tell them, but show them. So we have video. We can present social media. We can do interactive graphics that include animations, which is a tremendous way of explaining complicated subjects. We have all these tools that are available to us right now, and we need to take advantage of all of those tools.
So as you're looking as the reporting staff, the basic effort to ferret out the facts, truth itself, is the skill set different from a reporter today than during Woodward and Bernstein, or is it the same skill set?
Well, I think the same reporting skills apply. We still have those reporting skills, but I think that reporters now are expected and need to do much more than they did in the past. They need to think about not just how to practice the journalism, but they need to think about their audience in a way that they never did before. They just took the audience for granted, and now we can't take the audience for granted at all. And so we have to do things more quickly. We have to think about how we present this in social media. We have to write in a different style. We have to work more collaboratively with all the different departments that we have. We have a video department. We have actually an audio department. We have interactive graphics. We have obviously photography. We have so many different departments, and we all have to think about how to present our work in a different media environment. We're publishing on so many different platforms now. It's not just print, obviously, and it's not just the web, certainly not just on a desktop, but it's on Apple News and it's on Snapchat. We now are talking about how do we present news on voice-activated devices like Amazon Echo and Google Home and Apple's similar product. So we're trying to think of all of these things, and so the reporter has to be a participant in that, and cannot be a bystander, cannot be somebody who just says somebody else should do that work. And they also need to understand, to some degree, our analytics, how we use metrics, and focus on that as well.
So what would you say about your job then as an executive editor and looking at these things? And what would you say to these media leaders in terms of their job? What do you concentrate on as editor? Is it different than when you were at Boston or Miami, for example?
It's changed. It started when I was in Miami because obviously we were focused. We had a website at the time, but it all seems like a simpler, easier era. That was well before high-speed broadband connections proliferated, and that was before, if you recall, when you had to download a photo, it was a very slow process, and you could just watch the photo coming onto the screen. And now, of course, that's not the case. So, and now you have a mobile environment, which we didn't have at the time. So that represented a very significant change. High-speed broadband connections represented a significant change, and it caused everything, all these trends that were beginning when I was in Miami in 2000 and 2001, they accelerated at an incredible pace. And so I think that part of the role of an editor is to sort of be aware of the entire landscape, make sure that you're hiring people who are skilled in the areas that we need, make sure that you're retraining the people who are on your staff in the skills that we need, because you don't want to lose them, because so many of them are they're such experts in their field, they're great writers, they're great reporters. You never want to lose talent like that. But what you want to do is make sure that that talent comes along with you as the field is changing. So, you know, from the standpoint of an editor, it's a much more complicated job these days than it was before. I remember when I was at the Boston Globe, and we had when I first got there, we had an entirely separate digital operation. It did not fall under me, and then the Boston Globe, which was then owned by the New York Times Company. The New York Times Company told us that we needed to integrate all those operations. And so the website would be under me, everything would be under me. And I said, well, that's great, except that I don't know anything about it. I don't even know I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how success is to be measured. There's so much that I just don't know. And of course, they offered no training whatsoever. So I actually worked with the Knight Foundation to encourage them to create a program for editors and their digital chiefs so that we could start to understand what was needed. And that was very helpful in terms of developing a digital strategy for the Boston Globe at that time. And it gave me a sense of the full panorama of responsibilities that I had at that stage of my career.
I want to get back to a little bit about the press freedoms, particularly with this group, where we just heard for a few hours reports from each of the countries, which were tremendous, by the way, so thank you for that, about the pressures on journalism and the gathering of news. America has the benefit of the First Amendment, the constitutional protections. With that protection, do you see an actual erosion of press freedoms, or are there simply obstacles? Or how would you kind of measure the landscape today?
Here in the United States?
In the United States.
Well, I wouldn't say that we have an erosion of press freedoms because we continue to practice with an extraordinary degree of freedom in the United States, thankfully, in contrast to what so many of you are experiencing in your own countries. So I guess we can't complain nearly as much as everyone here, and our worries are not nearly as great as yours. But there are substantial worries because historically, historically in the United States, we've had sort of unrestrained freedom, essentially. I mean, certain restraints, but for the most part, we've been able to do what we want. And now we have a president who has so more than any other president, even more than Richard Nixon, who was attacking the press quite aggressively during his administration, we have a president who has sought to undermine the press, who has sought to discredit us, to delegitimize us, even to dehumanize us. So during the campaign, he called us garbage, scum. At one point, he said we were the lowest form of humanity, and then that wasn't enough. So he said we were the lowest form of life. And then he became president. He described us as the enemy of the people. He made extraordinary statements about how we were essentially suggesting that we were unpatriotic, that we were seeking to hurt the country. And he's done everything he can to try to destroy the credibility of the independent press in this country. And so that is not a direct control over what we can say or do, but it's an effort to minimize the impact that we can have with the work we do by causing people to doubt our truthfulness and to doubt our motives, even to doubt our patriotism. And obviously he's had some success in that regard, and that's concerning, I think, for any of us, because we have certain pillars of democracy in this country. We have the executive branch, which is the president. We have the legislative branch, which is the Congress, the two houses of Congress. We have the courts, and then we have what's called the fourth estate, the press. And that's it. That's all our system. Well, he's essentially in control of, certainly the presidency is in control of, and largely part of the Congress, at least it's under one party. He has sought to undermine the court system in certain ways, and to call into question the legitimacy of certain court rulings. And then he is, of course, all the time, every day, every month, going after the press, which is his favorite target. And so he wants to make it so that essentially, it seems as if he wants to make it as if he should be the only source of information and the only source of truth. And that is not what our system, that's not what our system is about. And one of the reasons we have had a strong democracy in this country is that we've had a strong press in this country. And as everyone here knows, there is no democracy without a free press. And it's not just that it's free, it should be independent, it needs to be strong, and it needs to hold powerful institutions and powerful individuals accountable, particularly our politicians and our policymakers.
So I know on occasion the president will call you to complain. Have you had an opportunity to challenge him on those points you just made, so eloquently, by the way?
He's called a couple of times. He doesn't call often. He's called a couple of times, most, as you say, to complain about the stories. I just basically listen and thank him for calling and sharing his perspective, and then it's over. So I don't really engage in that kind of conversation, and I don't think the conversations actually lend themselves to a dialogue. So they tend to be a little one-sided. One person is speaking. No, I haven't had a chance to talk to him about it, and I don't know how constructive it would be, but I'd be happy to have that conversation with him if he ever wants to have it.
So here's the interesting thing. So journalists, and I alluded to this earlier this morning when I was speaking with you, journalists have as a tenet giving voice to the voiceless, which is by very nature representing the people. The press is the people coming forth trying to ask questions. Donald Trump has taken it to saying, no, the people elected me, I'm the guy, you're the enemy. And so you have this odd division. Is there something to be done to take the conversation beyond identifying the problem, but finding a solution?
There may be something, I just don't know what it is. And that's the problem, that therein is a problem. We're a highly polarized society right now, polarized in our politics, polarized also in our consumption of news and information. And it seems to be getting worse, not better. And people are drawn to sources of information that affirm their pre-existing point of view. And they're not necessarily, and it's not just that they're looking for places that affirm their opinions. They're looking for sources of information that will provide them so-called facts and so-called information that it turns out that many of these are actually falsehoods and crackpot conspiracy theories. And that's true on the left too, by the way. It's not just true on the right. And so that is a really concerning development, because in order to have a healthy democracy, you need to have debate. You need to have disagreement about the analysis of our problems, the prescription for solving those problems. But you need to agree on a baseline set of facts. And today we're in a situation where we can't even agree on what happened yesterday. So I mean, it's extraordinary. And you know, look, I mean, I think that the president has fed into this. I mean, from day one, actually, with the day after the inauguration, his press secretary took issue with the press for saying that the inaugural crowds were smaller than those for Obama's first inauguration. And it was obvious from images of the inauguration that that in fact was the case, that it wasn't as big. And that wasn't a criticism of it, it's just a fact. And his press secretary came out and said that this was the largest inauguration ever, period. And that wasn't a good start, I think, in terms of truth-telling. And it's probably gone downhill since then.
Well, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question. I've been at various conferences myself the past month, and journalists tend to be they're not all the same. Certainly, media is fractured as society is fractured. But do you think journalists can respect Donald Trump on some level? Or as we speak to diversity in a newsroom, if you ask journalists to stand up and say who supports Donald Trump, who supports Hillary Clinton, journalists won't even want to stand up. So how do you get that diversity of conservative, liberal into a newsroom when you have someone divisive in the White House?
Right. Well, I don't think they should stand up, and I don't think that it should be asked of them. I don't think that we should have a litmus test for the people we hire and ask them what their politics are. I've never done that over, you know, in the entire time that I've been a top editor, and that's 17 years, and I never did it as an editor at any other level either. And we have a lot of people who have different perspectives on our staff. I mean, we have somebody on our staff who, she grew up in a household of 12 kids. She was homeschooled. She went to an evangelical university, and she now covers healthcare for us. Her roommate, also from college, also works for us, and she covers religion. We've hired vets into our newsroom. We've hired, you know, there's an assumption that people come from all the same background, sort of elite Eastern or coastal centers. And that's not true at all. Our deputy national editor grew up on a farm in Western Pennsylvania. Her brother still runs the farm. And, you know, people have come, we have the person in charge of our coverage of the White House is the son of a Lutheran minister. We have just, you know, we have all types of people in our newsroom, as we should. But I would never ask them to declare what their politics are, and I never will. I don't think that it's a relevant aspect. Does that mean that we can't cover the president fairly or truthfully? No, I don't think so. I mean, look, there are all sorts of other professions where, you know, there's a bizarre analysis, comparison, but, you know, look, doctors have to treat anybody who comes in and treat them well. They're professionals. Lawyers have to represent anyone and represent them well, regardless of what they think of them. You know, I think that we can cover the president regardless of his attacks on us and cover him fairly. And I don't think that we have to determine what the politics are. I mean, maybe that would change with every administration. We'd have to have an entirely different staff. And you know, this is an interesting question because it's always asked, it's occasionally asked of me at the Washington Post, but it's never asked of Fox News, Breitbart, Daily Caller, all these media outlets that are on the right. Nobody asked them about the diversity of the politics of the people on their staff. And they only ask it of us. And my view is that if somebody's going to ask that question, they should ask it of everybody. But I don't think anybody should have a political litmus test.
I happen to agree with you on that, just for those of you sending these tweets across the world. Are we doing a good enough job getting that message out, though? What you just said is fascinating, although I bet most of the country doesn't know that about the Washington Post.
No, we're not actually doing a good enough job of getting that out. But I think we will. So you heard from Jeff Jarvis yesterday, but there's another project called the Trust Project, I should say, that Google is also supporting and has some support from elsewhere. And one of the things that they want is to have more extensive biographical information about each writer. And I'm delighted to have that because we have writers with a tremendous amount of expertise and experience. They come from all over the country, and including people who come from overseas. We have, some people from Latin America. We have people from Spain. Our graphics department is heavily oriented toward people from Spain, and I'm happy to talk about that and have people know us better. I think it's important that people know who we are. One of the reasons that I go around speaking so much is because I just think people need to know who we are and how we think, and we need to be more transparent about that and about how we do our work.
Jeff's comments yesterday were very interesting. He spoke about the different communities, and that somehow one of the aspects of journalism is to bridge those communities. And it seems to me, and hearing what you say, you probably agree that letting them know who we are so that journalists can represent and be that voice probably is a direction that can help combat some of these issues that we're facing today.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how successful we're going to be at bridging the divides in our country at the moment. These are big divides, and they've been getting bigger. But we have a whole staff of people on our national reporting staff, of people whose responsibility is to just travel around the country, spend a lot of time everywhere in the country, talking to people, taking the measure of what their concerns are, reflecting that in stories that we do, and trying to reach sort of the so-called forgotten America. And I don't think it's been forgotten, but certainly we can write more about it. We can focus on it more. And I think that we definitely need to do that. One thing that we're also likely to do soon is if you read an opinion piece, we're going to use actually probably machine learning to know kind of what that piece is about, and then offer people an alternative point of view and ask them, would you like to read an alternative point of view? And if they say yes, then another column will show up.
But that would all be done automatically?
Yeah.
Does that scare you at all?
No, it means I don't have to use any staff to do it. I think that's great. If the machine can, I believe that if a machine can do something, we should let the machine do it and let the humans do something of higher and different value.
So machines leads us into the two words we want to talk about for a little bit of time here, and that's fake news. First, how would you define it? And I know we've read and we feel like the president perhaps co-opted that. But where do you see fake news now? And even to have the conversation, people have different orientations to what fake news is. What is it for you, and what role is it playing in how we're doing our jobs?
Right. Well, I think the president's idea of fake news is anything that does not conform to his account of events would be called fake news. So I remember when he said, quite distinctly, I remember when he said that if you see any negative polls about me, that's fake news. Just, by being negative, they have to be fake news. So it's true, anything that doesn't conform to his account of events is what he views as fake news. I would say what fake news is not. It's not a mistake. We all make mistakes, we're human. In this business, we should acknowledge our mistakes and then correct those mistakes. But what I think of fake news is basically the deliberate spread of false and misleading information and conspiracy theories that solely for the purpose of pursuing an ideology or undermining people's understanding of the truth.
How did we allow fake news to be redefined? Were journalists asleep at the switch? Does the president just have the loudest bully pulpit? Because it did change, and I have similar examples where we're trying to talk in the newsroom and to people who are questioning us about fake news, saying, no, these are intentional attacks by people trying to make money or change something. How do we get to this place that fake news has this definition?
Well, you know, when somebody like Donald Trump runs for president and says it time and time and time again, and then he wins the nomination, and then when he repeats it constantly from the position of the most powerful man in the world, it has an effect. It's undeniable that it has an effect. And he has certain supporters who, supporters who stayed with him and believe in him very strongly for reasons that, I understand. And they're willing to accept whatever he says. That if he says it's fake news, it must be fake news. And there's a low level of trust, and there's a low level of trust, of course, in the media. There was before he became president. Trust in the media had been declining for many years. And so that created an environment that he could exploit. And he has exploited it with some considerable success. And there's about 70% of Republicans in this country now believe that the mainstream press makes up stories. It's extraordinary. And so, we're having to deal with that. Now, our declining levels of trust they mirror what is a decline of trust in pretty much all institutions in the United States. There's been a decline in trust in Congress, where Congress is actually trusted less than the media in this country. There's been a huge decline in trust in the presidency over the last year, to the point where trust in the presidency is just about at the level of trust in the media. And so in that strange way, he's bringing us closer together. And then you see a decline in trust in organized religion, a decline in trust in business, decline in trust in the medical system. The only institutions that have maintained their levels of trust are, number one, the military, which has been high and remains very high, and number two, law enforcement, which is beginning to decline somewhat. But there's been a decline of trust in all institutions, and I think there's now a decline of trust, and we just had a poll today that we published, basically a decline in trust in our democracy here in the United States, and that's, I think, very concerning.
So trust becomes the key issue. Can trust be a part of a business model? How do you rebuild trust, or what are you doing at the Washington Post, for example, to build trust and get back into this space?
Try to tell the truth, day in and day out. Work really hard as reporters. Try to show more of our work so that people can see it, see what our reporting is based upon. Talk about how many people we have talked to. Try to, as I said earlier, try to reveal more. We'll plan to reveal more about who our reporters are, what their background is, what their experience is. But ultimately, it has to be just good, strong reporting that ends up being validated over the long run. Look, at the time of the Nixon administration, the press was under severe attack from the administration. And the first vice president, Spiro Agnew, was constantly attacking the press until he had to resign in scandal, but the attacks continued from the administration. And during the Watergate investigation, the levels of trust in the American press were very low. That investigation, led by the Washington Post, was viewed as a partisan enterprise, partisan effort. And so, but then it turned out that the reporting was actually validated. It was true. And ultimately, because of an impeachment process, the president had to resign. And then levels of trust in the press rose to sort of the highest level we've seen since. We've never been that high since. And it's about 55%, which is about as high as we'll ever get, because people will always be upset with over something. So we will never get to the levels of the military, but if we're above 50%, that's a pretty good number. And so my concern, what I focus on is how solid is our reporting, and will that reporting be validated over the long run? And I focus on the long run. And I believe that our reporting will, in fact, be validated over the long run.
When you say show, that's something I think can translate to other media properties. Is there a transparency standard that journalists should have in terms of showing what and how we're doing?
Well, I think that there should be, we need greater levels of transparency. I don't know what the standard should be, and maybe that will be, we'll figure that out over some period of time as to how much of the work we want to disclose. But I think we need to disclose more of it. We need to show original documents. We need to show, perhaps show more of the audio, maybe the full audio of the interviews we conducted, the full transcript of the interviews we conducted, maybe, you know, just more of things like that that actually show the effort that we took in reporting out a story. And I don't know exactly what the standard should be, but I think we need to do more than what we're doing today.
There was, at the Online News Association held in Washington a few weeks ago, at the end of the session, there was a futurist who came and presented kind of a report and talked about possible scenarios, and one of the scenarios was looking to institutional collapses across the world if sort of journalism didn't embrace technology in a way that builds trust. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is there is now the ability to take a photo and extrapolate a fake video out of that, fake audio, and the example they used just showed an image, a video of President Obama making a speech, and the whole thing was fabricated. So given this technology that absolutely can convince the eye and the ear that something is true, how does journalism respond to try and make sure that, yes, we are credible, and yes, you can trust what these journalistic time-honored institutions are doing?
Look, I mean, that's a real issue, the manipulation of photographs, the manipulation of videos, the construction of entirely fake videos, the construction of entirely fake stories, all of that. I think that's the greatest challenge that we have in this business today, is that the public, because of a lot of this, the public has no idea what's really true. So they tend to say, I'll go with what I believe, and it doesn't matter what you're publishing. And so I don't know that I have an answer to that, to tell you the truth. I mean, I just feel that we need to do what we've always done, and that is do a good job of reporting, make sure that we're fair, honest, honorable, and accurate, and that and I believe that reporting will be borne out over the long run. And that some of these other outfits will ultimately suffer the consequences of their determination to propagate falsehoods.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's interesting, you know, the president has, you know, he keeps calling us fake news, and he says that when we have anonymous sources, and he's focused heavily on anonymous sources, that when they say anonymous sources, they don't have any sources. So, which is really remarkable, because we had early on during his administration, we wrote about how his national security advisor at the time, General Michael Flynn, had conversations with the Russians about lifting sanctions, even though he had said previously that he had no conversations along those lines. And so ultimately, as a result of that disclosure by us, the president dismissed General Flynn. He was only in his office in that position for 20 days, I think it was. And he dismissed him, and he said that he had not told the truth to the vice president, because the vice president went out and said that he had had no conversations, that General Flynn had had no conversations with the Russians, including about lifting sanctions. And it turned out that he had. So Trump said that he was dismissing him because he hadn't told the truth to the vice president. Then, several weeks later, he gave a talk, a speech, in which he said, and we said in our story that we had 9 sources for that information. And then he went out and he gave a speech, and he said, these people say they have 9 sources, they have no sources. And it was bizarre and head-spinning, because he had just dismissed the national security advisor on the very basis of the facts that we had reported, and yet he still argued that it was somehow fake. And right now, they are doing, the Attorney General has announced that they are conducting more leak investigations than even the Obama administration was conducting. And the Obama administration had launched more leak investigations than any prior administration. And it's interesting because in order to have a successful leak investigation, there has to be a source, an actual person who leaked, and there has to be and the story has to be true. So if we didn't have any sources and what we published wasn't true, why are they launching leak investigations? It makes no sense whatsoever.
But this is some of the problems we're having now, right? Trying to assess and calibrate how to even engage the conversation, whether it's with the president or the president's staff, because as you say, there's not a baseline of facts to start from. And that makes
well, there's a baseline, but people aren't embracing that baseline set of facts.
We're going to open it up for questions in just a minute, but I just wanted to take a minute to talk about the business model of the Washington Post, which has solved a few things, introduced a few things. What can you tell us about your business model? What have you learned? Do you have guiding principles that are relatable to the rest of us here?
Well, you know, it's hard to say because we've done a lot of different things. We certainly, I mean, we changed our strategy completely. We had been before Jeff Bezos acquired us, we had been a news organization that focused primarily on our region. So Washington, D.C., the state of Maryland, the state of Virginia, recognizing that the nation's capital was situated there, and so of course we had to cover politics and policy. But we did not position ourselves as a truly national news organization. And so, we changed it, and Jeff said that, look, he didn't think that regional strategy would work, that we should have a national strategy, because we were in the nation's capital, so that was a good spot to do it from. We were called the Washington Post, which is a name and a brand that can extend nationally. And number three, we had a history and identity, going back to Watergate, that was our same identity today, and the identity that we wanted for ourselves. An institution that holds our government, our politicians, our policymakers accountable. And so we changed our strategy. So to me, the lesson for that is that I do think that every news organization really has to go through a thorough evaluation of what its strategy is, and not assume that the one that it has is the correct one. The other thing that we did is we then said, all right, we're in a digital age, and there are all sorts of things happening to us that are problematic. So, for example, one of the first questions that Jeff asked me was, okay, you spend 3 months doing a major investigation. You published you've invested a lot of time, you've invested a lot of resources, and you publish that investigation, and 15 minutes later, somebody else has summarized your investigation, and they get all the web traffic from it. How do you think about that? You know, that was like the first quiz. So, so I passed that quiz because I said that we needed to aggregate ourselves. So we needed to have other reporters who are writing about aspects of that investigation and aggregate them. So we do with our bloggers who are writing about it. And we needed to aggregate other people. And in the current environment, we needed, and so we created we set up some units in our newsroom that heavily relied on aggregation. Not entirely. They did their own reporting, they did their own writing, they wrote in a particular style, but they didn't feel they had to personally report every last detail as long as they were relying on credible sources of information. And so we had to change our thinking on that. We had to think of, okay, well, how do we want to, we expanded our social media team, our audience, what we call audience engagement team. And because we need to make sure that the work that we're doing is actually successfully disseminated throughout the social networks, because the traffic comes from the social networks. So we built that up. So we went step by step. There are a lot of things that we've done that I think are translatable to news organizations everywhere. Our model is not going to be the model for every news organization. Each one is going to have to come up with its own. But the other thing that we've now done is that we've put a huge emphasis on subscriptions. We just announced that we passed 1 million digital-only subscriptions earlier this year. That's on top of the people who receive a print subscription and get digital access with that print subscription. And we expect to, continue on that path. Subscriptions have been hugely important in changing our financial fortunes. We're having an exceptionally good year as a result of that growth. And the growth is tremendous. I mean, our subscriptions are now double what they were at the beginning of the year and triple what they were a year ago. And that's exceptional growth. Now, somebody might say, well, that's all because of Trump. And certainly Trump had an impact on that. But there's been a fundamental change in the attitude of the American public. They are wary of outfits that are spreading falsehoods and conspiracy theories. They're nervous about that. They see the value of traditional news organizations and understand better the work that we do and our role in the democracy. And now they've concluded that they need to support us. And they've come to realize that if they don't support quality journalism, they won't have quality journalism. So this moment in history, at least in the United States, is one in which the public has begun to shift in its thinking about the press and our role in society and their need to support it.
One last thing on business model. Can you speak a little bit about partnerships? Some organizations, and maybe perhaps here in Mexico or South America, how are you able to manage partnerships in terms of maintaining control over a project or journalistic integrity, but trying to leverage, resources and reach?
Partnerships with, what kinds of partnerships are you thinking of?
Well, I'm thinking other media partnerships or a partnership such that there might be a sponsorship to a project, or there's, journalism organizations will say, we'll grant you $12,000 for an investigative reporter to do a specific project. It's easy to kind of maintain the journalistic integrity of that project when it's a journalism organization.
Right.
But if you're going out to try and do other kinds of partnerships to get reach into a certain area, perhaps to build these bridges that have...
Like certain nonprofits and things like that?
Yes.
That are, yeah. Well, it's not a problem that we have because we don't do that. But I think you have to be very careful about who you're partnering with because they have many of these organizations have a specific agenda that they want to promote. And if your story doesn't end up promoting that agenda, they're not going to fund you. And I think that you have to be really careful about what kinds of partnerships you enter into.
What about media partnerships then? Breaking down a little bit of the wall of competition between media groups in the interest of trying to do something to protect freedom or to protect democracy?
Well, we do that. We do that with nonprofit media groups. So there's one in New York called ProPublica. We've done that. There's another one called the Marshall Project, which focuses on criminal justice. We've partnered with them. We've partnered with the International Center for Investigative Journalism in Washington. We've partnered with other centers of investigative journalism elsewhere. We're totally willing to do that. I think it can be constructive. It's often complicated, but it can be very effective at times.
Why don't we open it up for questions? You see the two microphones here. If you can come to the microphone.
They can ask in Spanish, yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I should. Oh, we'll try it.
So Marty speaks Spanish, so not to speak for you, but you can ask your questions in Spanish.
No voy a contestar las preguntas en español, desafortunadamente, porque yo voy a cometer demasiados errores.
Hi.
Falsos.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Armando Castilla from Mexico. How important is for the Washington Post to investigate on the Mexican and Latin America corruption acts that are being part in the United States and around the world? I don't know if, do you develop a special target on the politicians and the organizations from Mexico and Latin America? Do you have any agenda there?
Well, we have a correspondent in Mexico. I think a very courageous correspondent, Josh Partlow, who's been writing a lot this year, as he has in the past, about drug trafficking and going into some pretty dangerous parts of Mexico to do that. And we have a correspondent, he's now working out of Miami to cover sort of the Caribbean, the countries on the Caribbean. We have a person on contract in Brazil. We will be adding in the coming year another correspondent for Latin America, which we sorely need. And then we also have a number of people in Washington who have been correspondents in Latin America, and they are working on, particularly on things involving the border, immigration, things of that sort. So somebody like Nick Meroff, who was living in Cuba, but he wasn't allowed to cover, he had to live there because his wife was doing her doctoral thesis there. But he was covering Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, all those countries, and some others, and so he too can get involved in those kinds of stories. So yes, it's really important for us.
Sir?
My name is Miguel Molina. I am an Ecuadorian journalist. I have a couple of questions regarding the difference you explained that exists between writing for a print newspaper and writing for the web, writing for all the new platforms like Snapchat and Apple News. And I want to know what is your opinion. Do you think that the print newspaper is going to disappear? And also, do you think that if the way we used to write news for a print newspaper is also going to disappear? I think that maybe a lot of people that in the current world used to read news prefer to read small news. Then I am wondering if the big news, the big stories, the big chronics are going also to we have to modify, to change the way we write them in order to adapt these big articles to the people which like to read, like in Twitter, very short stories. That's the question. Thank you.
Well, there are a lot of questions in there, actually, so let me see if I can address them. As to whether print is going to go away, I assume so. I don't know when. These things can take a long time because we do have a lot of people who prefer to read in print, and they're very loyal, and they want us to keep the print edition. And we're very happy to have them, and we want to keep them satisfied. But I think we have to recognize that we live in a digital society. Everybody's on a mobile phone. They walk down the streets looking at a mobile phone. If they have a spare moment while they're waiting for a bus or they're waiting in the grocery line, they're looking at their mobile phone. That's where they are, and that's where this society is headed. So I think not to prepare ourselves for that moment when print disappears would be a grave mistake on our part. I don't believe that print is going to make a recovery, because that's not how people are living their lives. And I think we should face up to that reality. I always tell people that, we're in the reality business, so maybe we should recognize reality in our own business. In terms of the writing style, I think it's important to think back to when radio came into existence. You don't do radio stories the same way that you do a print story. It has its own idiom. It has its own way of expression. And then television came along, and that was a visual medium. And the way you tell stories on television is not by reading newspaper stories. It has its own way of communication. And it's not how you do it on radio, and it's definitely not how you do it in print. It is distinct to television. So along came the internet, and we said, great. And what did we do? We published our print stories on the web, and that wasn't the best way to present it. We said we're digital now because it's on a digital platform. But being digital does not mean just being on a digital platform. And it didn't work. And so then we said, well, let's publish them faster. And that didn't really work. I mean, it's better. We need to do it, but it's not the only thing we need to do. And then we said, publish them shorter. And that's not entirely the answer either, by the way. So there's just a different, in many instances, not all instances, there's just a different way of communicating it. And in many instances, our most successful things are when people are kind of having a conversation with the reader as if they were sitting there talking to you in person, if you were sitting at a table and having a conversation and they were explaining a complicated subject to you. And it didn't take the structure that we have in a newspaper, the way that we have the first few paragraphs and the way that we summarize what the story's all about and all the structure that we have. That structure was created, that we all learned, that was created for newspapers. It wasn't created for the web. And so I do think we need to rethink that. Will it only be short stories like Twitter-sized stories? Well, no, I don't think so. What we're actually seeing is that there's a huge demand for stories that are longer, that are investigative, that are more explanatory, that are more narrative. Many of the traditional stories that we love, traditional journalists love to do and think are important and central to our mission. But I do think that we need to think about presentation of those stories, because those stories need to be read. They need to be read on a mobile phone. And you need to think about, okay, well, what does that mean? And how do we present the story? How do we show graphics? Are there animations that you can present? Is there a video that can provide more information at that point, provided in context where it's mentioned in a story? We are using, for example, annotations on stories now, particularly on speeches that are given or press conferences that are given. So you click on the annotation and then there's commentary on the side, and the readers can provide their own commentary on that particular portion of the speech. So I think that we need to rethink how we present our stories in a digital environment. And it doesn't mean that we don't do long stories. It doesn't mean we don't do investigative stories. In fact, if we look at, I said that we were paying a lot of attention to subscriptions, and the stories that generate the subscriptions where people begin to convert to becoming a subscriber, that make them loyal to us and willing to pay, are the investigative work, the thoughtful opinion pieces that we do of all different ideologies, people from all different ideologies, the narrative stories that we do, the explanatory stories that we do, all of the more deeply reported and more elegantly written stories.
Thank you. Sir?
Casi nadie, sí. Es una ciudad tan cerca de los Estados Unidos. Es una broma en Miami.
Sí. Hola, Martín. ¿Se escucha? Hola. ¿Ves similitudes entre las técnicas de desacreditación de Donald Trump y las utilizadas por gobiernos populistas de la región, como los de Argentina, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador en el pasado? Y en todo caso, ¿es de esperar, a tu entender, que haya en el futuro algún intento de Trump de avanzar en algún tipo de limitación más directa contra la prensa, con las diferencias que obviamente tiene el sistema republicano de Estados Unidos?
I'm not sure that there's, I mean, I don't know exactly what his intention is in the long run. I think that at the moment he doesn't have to impose strict controls on the media. Certainly he wouldn't even be allowed to in this country. But he almost doesn't have to because he's worked so successfully to try to undermine our credibility. And that's all he needs to do. He doesn't need to have the kinds of controls that you have in Venezuela or in other countries. And I don't think that that's, I'm not sure that that's where he's going. I think that what he's going to try to do is day in and day out, try to undermine our credibility so that people simply don't trust us as a source of information.
Thank you. I think you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Barham, for your words. I come from a business school, IE Business School in Spain, which is part of Catalonia these days, and it's a joke, obviously. And my question, my question is, if I understood you well, you put the future of journalism into the hands of good reporting. And to me, isn't that a too good-hearted approach to what's happening to the press? Aren't we opposing just flowers to weapons in the current state of the press?
Well, maybe so. I don't know. But what is your alternative?
Well, I don't know. You are the executive director. You are the executive director of a very important world media, I would say, because people are looking at you. I mean,
yes.
the important thing about the Washington Post is people are looking at you.
Right, I noticed. No pressure. But I actually think it is the way to go because, and I don't think it represents flowers because words can be very powerful, facts can be very powerful. And what we're seeing already in the latest polls about trust in the press, the approval ratings, trust ratings for the press have actually begun to go up again, which is interesting. And you see this growth in subscriptions. It's happening with the New York Times, it's happening with us, it's happening with certain magazines here in the United States. And so I think that you see that there are because the reporting is actually being borne out, because it is being validated over the longer run, I think that is at least a good part of the answer, is to continue to do that. I do think that we have to call out falsehoods as much as we can find them, that we have to expose them, we have to discredit them. Now, whether those stories have any real effect with the people who believe that information, that's not at all certain, but we still have an obligation to expose them. I don't know of any other answer, frankly. I think that we just need to keep doing our jobs and doing it well. And I think that truth is not flowers against weapons. I think it's actually more powerful than that. And I think we see in so many parts of the world, ideas can be incredibly powerful. I mean, you know, if you look at what's happening in Catalonia right now, I mean, the ideas are shaping events, you know, for better or for worse, depending on somebody's perspective. And you see that in many other countries too. And so I don't, at least here in the United States, I think that that's an answer for us.
Let's go to Mr. Rock. You had a question? Or here? Okay.
Mr. Barron, Hassan Nassar from Colombia, RCN Radio. Yesterday, one of the main speakers, Professor Javis, was saying that he was even going to propose maybe for American journalists to get some experience and background from Latin American journalists because they are more used to deal with politicians, that they know for sure that 90% of what they are saying is just lies. And in that sense, I'm going to the sense of education. Do you think that journalists nowadays in different universities around the world are getting prepared the right way to cover stories, to do the right work? Because I'm under the impression that the Trump issue in the United States has changed the way you in America perceive journalism. And you are trying to see how we are covering stories in other parts of the world. And I want to know your impression about that.
Well, I don't know how well people are being trained. I mean, the people that we hire, and we hire quite a few young journalists every year, they're very impressive. They have a strong sense of mission. They know how to do their jobs. They dig beneath the surface. They're skeptical but not cynical. And so I would say that the ones that we are seeing are highly prepared to do the kind of work that needs to be done. Many of them have, some people have expertise in data journalism. Some people have expertise in investigative journalism. Many of them have a very sophisticated understanding of social networks and understand what's happening there so that we can actually observe what's happening in social networks and understand what kind of impact that can have on the information ecosystem. So I haven't seen I mean, there's some are better than others. I mean, like, you know, the people who are being trained for journalism, some are better than others. But I think that we are seeing a generation, the generation that's coming up in journalism right now in the United States is very similar to the generation of my generation when I came up, which was during Watergate. And so I think people are very influenced by what they're seeing, the kind of work that's being done, the investigative work that's being done. I hope, I've been told that the movie had some impact on people, inspiring people to get into this field, having a better understanding of why this kind of work is necessary and what it takes to do the work correctly. So I'm encouraged by the people I see getting into the field.
Thank you.
Movie, what movie was that?
I don't know, Spotlight.
Some movie? Yes.
Marty, como en Miami en español, hay relaciones intempestuosas que no había antes, especialmente en el tema de Facebook, Google, algunos considerados frenemies. El Washington Post ha estado experimentando y otros medios en Estados Unidos con diferentes modelos con el tema de Facebook, pero no tan solo en contenido, sino también con cuestiones de publicidad. Y eso es tal vez el problema más grande que hay entre los medios tradicionales y los grandes nuevos jugadores. Si nos podrías contar cómo ha sido la evolución del Washington Post en el corto tiempo en la relación con Facebook, qué es lo que aspiran, y siendo que Facebook cambia y tienen el poder de cambiar y experimentar continuamente y los medios estamos un poco retrasados.
Right. Well, there's no question that Facebook, Google, Apple are hugely important in our field. And you're right, they are, as we call them, frenemies, both friends and enemies. There's not much that I can, people ask me, well, what do we do about that? Number one, there's nothing I can do about it because they exist, and I have to deal with that. We have to deal with that reality. And so what we try to do is establish healthy, constructive partnerships with Google, Facebook, and Apple, and I think that we have them. We have been encouraging them to, I do think that they are sensitive to what is happening and beginning to be sensitive to what has happened in this country and how maybe they have helped facilitate so-called fake news, how they've facilitated conspiracy theories, and they've begun, and I emphasize begun, to face up to their responsibilities in that regard, that it can no longer just be a matter of them collecting revenues and not bearing responsibility. So, our conversations with them, we've had conversations with them about that, but the entire industry has had conversations with them about that. And I think they've begun to take some steps to deal with it, but it's clearly, there's a long way to go. The other is how can they support our model? Because if they want to promote trustworthy information, then they're going to have to help trustworthy institutions. And so I think they've begun to do that. So I think Google, for example, has announced that it's no longer going to have a policy of first click free, meaning that anything that appears in search has to be free, that if somebody clicks on it, it must be free. In an environment like that, it would be very difficult to have a paywall. And so they've now said they're abandoning that, and we can have a paywall. We can set however many stories we want, and that we wouldn't be penalized for that. So we're going to be experimenting with that and trying to set the level at what we think is appropriate. And we're encouraged by what we're hearing from Google. Facebook is now introducing a pay model, or has announced that it is. It appears that they want to maintain 10 free articles from each media outlet alone over the course of a month. That is not very conducive to subscriptions, because the number of people who actually read 10 stories per month from any one media outlet on Facebook is very low. And the number of people who, if they were to hit the paywall, the percentage of people who then convert is also very low. So we're talking about minuscule numbers in terms of converting people to subscribers. So I think that Facebook, and now Facebook is in a dispute with Apple, because if they have this pay model, then Apple wants to collect a portion of the revenues as well, because if it's in the App Store, they want their 30%. So we don't know what's going to happen with the Facebook plan. But I think it's encouraging that they're beginning to at least talk about it and listen to us. We have had extensive conversations with them about this at the highest levels, and I think they're beginning to come around.
Let's do a question here, and then we'll close with one final question. But go ahead, sir. Thanks.
Hello, Martin. Let me ask you, after 4 years that Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post, from your perspective, what will be the influence or the legacy in our industry?
Well, I mean, I think it would be an important legacy if all he did would be to turn around the Washington Post. I think that would be important. So for most people, that would be considered quite an accomplishment. And I think he's already achieved that. So, but I think I suspect it will go beyond that. I think that people will try to draw lessons from us. I mean, one thing that we haven't talked about much, because I know that you had a presentation from Matt Monahan from the Washington Post yesterday, is, and setting aside ARC, is that we are putting a huge emphasis on technology. Technology is incredibly important to us. We can't just be in a position where we tell our reporters and all our editors just work harder and work longer, and we're holding a whip and asking them to do more work. We need tools, and the tools have to come from our technology team and from our engineers. And so we have a tool that improves the recommendation engine. So you know, it seeks to determine, based on your reading pattern, what you would like to read, might want to read next. And so it offers up stories. That's algorithmic. No human is involved in that. We've tried that with humans. They didn't do such a good job. The machine does a much better job. The machine should do it. But we need to have a good machine and a good algorithm to do that. That's one example. The ability to offer different presentations of headlines and summaries and photos, and not just do A/B testing, but do as much testing as you want to, is very helpful. The workflow tools in our newsroom. As I said, we're publishing on multiple platforms. Before, everybody was sending emails back and forth. I've got this. Can you consider this for the homepage? Can you? And then it wouldn't happen, and then people say, "Well, I told you about it." And yes, it was it was email number 132, and you didn't notice it. So now we have a tool that all the people who are publishing on all of our platforms, they know everything that's happening. They know when the stories are expected to be delivered. They can peer into those stories so that they can preview those stories. And you know, I think that is, we need those tools. So I think the introduction, the emphasis on technology and the importance that technology will play in our business, I think will be a legacy of Jeff's as well, and the use of metrics and the constructive use of metrics in our business. And how to use them correctly, how not to use them. We're not using them to decide what stories we work on. We're using them in a much more constructive way. And so, including how to find subscribers, like how to best find the subscribers, and by the way, and what offer to make to them. So, you know, Jeff comes out of a business that, he created a business that emphasizes technology and consumer. It's a consumer business, so he knows a lot about consumer behavior. And those areas are the ones that we as a business, I think, need to focus on, and I think that will be his legacy. And also, and finally, his legacy will be that he's an owner who doesn't feel that he needs, thankfully, he's an owner who doesn't feel that he needs to inject himself into our coverage. He lets us have the independence that we need in our newsroom to pursue the stories that we think we should pursue. And he doesn't tell us what stories to do. He doesn't tell us what stories not to do. He doesn't criticize the stories we've done, including stories that are about Amazon, including some that are not particularly positive. And so I think that the notion of having an owner who brings expertise, brings both financial capital and intellectual capital, but also respects the independence and mission of the news organization, I think that's a pretty good legacy. And I hope that he sticks with us for a long, long time. So,
thanks.
Hi, Gerardo Reyes. I am the director of the investigative unit of Univision Network in Miami. My question is, Martin, you and other media outlets have done such a good job in exposing the very serious ethical and legal problems, not only of the president, but of his government. My question will be, are you happy with the effect and consequences of those stories in terms of legal actions and responsibility from the government? And if, in that sense, do you trust in the process of investigation that the president is facing now?
I'm sorry, what was the last question you asked?
Do you trust in the investigation that the president is facing now?
Well, I mean, I'm generally happy with the way that our stories have had an impact. I mean, look, we put it out there, people can decide for themselves. We have a democracy, people, they make up their own mind, and I respect that. And, you know, the same democracy that elected Donald Trump is the democracy that gives us our freedoms to do our work as we see fit. I don't believe that there would be a special counsel investigation were it not for the work of the Washington Post. We were the first to disclose that General Flynn had discussions with the Russians, contrary to what he said about the possibility of lifting of sanctions. We were the first to disclose that the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, also had discussions with the Russians, even though that contradicted his testimony during his confirmation hearing. And so he had to recuse himself from the investigation. And so I don't believe that there would be a special counsel without those two stories and other stories that we've done as well. And so you know, what we saw here was, by the account of the unanimous consent of all of the intelligence agencies in the United States, was Russian intervention in the American election. And the question has arisen as to whether there was collaboration between elements of the Trump campaign and Russians. And so, you know, should there be a serious investigation? Well, the evidence suggests there should, when you have all of the intelligence agencies saying that there was this interference. And so now I think with the special counsel's investigation, it's truly independent. They have incredibly high quality lawyers working there. I mean, some of the most respected lawyers in the country. And they've decided, you know, to give up their private practice for now and participate in this investigation. So it seems to me to be a very vigorous and independent investigation to date. And you know, I think when we have investigations in this country, they should be vigorous and independent. Now, the so-called investigations in Congress, well, that might be a different matter, but that's a political place. And so, but as to the special counsel's investigation, it appears to be, we don't know that much about it, to tell you the truth. They've kept their secrets pretty well, but it appears to be vigorous and it appears to be independent.
Mr. Rock.
Sí, son dos preguntas, espero hacerlas brevemente. La primera es, insistiendo que el Washington Post es la catedral del periodismo en Washington, hace una década algunos integrantes del Post salieron para crear político. Y hace poco, algunos años, leí, creo que en el Vanity Fair, a un funcionario de la Casa Blanca diciendo que lo último que hacía antes de dormir y lo primero que hacía al despertarse era consultar una columna de Político, no recuerdo, muy famosa de Político. Como este fenómeno de portales, que son portales noticiosos, que no le apuestan a lo viral, que no le apuestan a los desnudos, Político le habla al mismo público que le habla el Washington Post, a la clase de iniciados en la política, tiene servicios muy especializados, etc. ¿Cómo se vive en un periódico de un gran legacy? ¿Cómo convive con este tipo de proyectos que están empezando a surgir en muchos países de la región? Y la segunda pregunta, me queda claro que el señor Bezos ha permitido que el Post sea considerado ahorita uno de los periódicos más innovadores en Estados Unidos. Pero no puedo dejar de recordar las biografías de Katharine Graham y de Ben Bradley, que yo atesoro mucho porque tengo unas autografiadas, donde platican cómo era la conversación entre el editor y la dueña. Cómo la dueña hacía fiestas muy importantes donde acudía a todo el mundo en Washington, pero no le decía a Ben Bradley que se había enterado. Y a veces le decía, no me quiero enterar de la noticia que vas a llevar mañana, pero son los personajes históricos legendarios de Watergate. Y en cierto momento este editor se sentaba con ella y le decía, bueno, tenemos que ir juntos en esto. Ahora en el mundo corporativo del Washington Post y de muchísimos periódicos más, ¿cómo se subsana esa ausencia donde el editor le dice a su dueño, vamos juntos?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the first question, but I'll try to deal with the second question.
Okay.
I mean, basically that's the relationship between the editor and the publisher, correct? And how do we work together? Essentially, is that right? Well, I mean, I think that you know, our relationship, it's always a tricky relationship between an editor and a publisher, and I'm sure that you're all very familiar with that, and an owner. Fortunately for us, we have an owner who he respects our mission. He respects what we do in the newsroom. He understands that in order for us to have credibility, which is our primary currency with the public, that we need to have our independence. And so I think that, so we have a good relationship. I mean, what we talk about, what he and I talk about, we do as a group. We meet every 2 weeks in a teleconference call, and we discuss the tactics and strategies of the Post. And that's what we talk about. If he has anything to say about the coverage, it's just like, terrific job covering the hurricanes. That's it. And he just doesn't inject himself into that. And for me, if he did, it would be a very difficult situation for me. I don't think that I could work in an environment like that. I think he knows that I wouldn't want to work in an environment like that. And fortunately, he doesn't require me to do that. And so that allows us to, I mean, look, he has all sorts of commercial interests, and but he allows us to do our job the way that we see fit. And I think in doing that, he strengthens the credibility of the Washington Post.
Marty, Matt has one quick question, and then we'll close for lunch.
Marty, thanks for being here. This has been really illuminating. My question for you is, what is it that we can do to re-engage northern and southern hemisphere, parts of our hemisphere, press relations across the region as Inter-American Press Association used to have? How can we re-engage, particularly the North American press, to be part of this regional freedom of the press mission?
I thought that was your job to figure that out.
I'm done on Monday.
Oh, you're done. Well, so you haven't done it the whole term? My God. I don't know. I mean, I think that there's clearly natural interest in the United States and what's happening in Latin America with regard to the press. I think people are keenly aware of the threats that are faced by the press in Latin America. Certainly they editorialize about it quite a bit. They try to offer their support through various organizations, whether it's Committee to Protect Journalists or whether it's Reporters Without Borders or some other organizations. I think, you know, with regard to this organization, I think that, I don't know, people have to understand, they have to feel that they're getting something out. Like every other organization, they have to feel they're getting something of incredible value out of it. And I mean, we see other press organizations that are, even in the United States, that are not doing so well. So ASNE, the American Society of News Editors, I mean, seems to continue shrinking, while the Online News Association is exploding in popularity. I think there were 3,800 people who attended the ONA convention this year. And I don't know how many people attended the American Society of News Editors, maybe 150. And I think the reason is because people felt that they they were getting something out of ONA, and they weren't sure what they were getting out of ASNE. And I mean, it was their convention, ASNE's convention was in Washington this year after ONA, and I'm in Washington, and I didn't go because I didn't see a lot on the program that would be of great value to me. And so we have to think, I think we have to think of these organizations in terms of how do we offer concrete value to people every time we attend every time we want to attend a conference. And if people don't see the value, they won't go. So I don't know, the organization has to think through itself. What is the value proposition that it's offering? And then if it's valuable for us, I think people will attend. But I think that's something for the organization to figure out for itself.
We'll leave it at that. If you please join me in thanking Marty for his fine wisdom today. Thank you.